When Marine Corps Captain Sarah Chen walked into her family's Thanksgiving dinner, wearing her new corporate badge, she never expected her own relatives to laugh in her face and tell her she wasn't qualified for the executive position she'd already been working for 3 months. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about their little Sarah. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of the elegant suburban home in Westchester County as Sarah Chen pulled her silver Honda Accord into the circular driveway. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The house looked exactly the same as it had during her childhood: pristine white columns, manicured hedges, and the kind of perfection that came with old money and older expectations. She sat for a moment in the driver's seat, adjusting the collar of her navy blazer and checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. At 31, Sarah had learned to dress for success in the corporate world, but somehow coming home always made her feel like she was 12 years old again, trying to prove herself worthy of the Chen family name. The badge clipped to her jacket read, Sarah Chen, Vice President of Operations, Meridian Technologies. It still felt surreal, even after 3 months on the job. When Meridian's CEO had personally recruited her from her military consulting firm, offering her a position that typically required 15 years of corporate ladder climbing, Sarah had known it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Her unique combination of military logistics expertise and advanced engineering degree made her exactly what the struggling defense contractor needed to turn around their failing project. Sarah grabbed the bottle of expensive wine from her passenger seat, a 2015 Bordeaux that had cost her nearly $200. She wanted everything to be perfect for this dinner. It had been 8 months since she'd seen her family, the longest gap since her discharge from the Marines 2 years ago. Her deployment schedule, and then her intensive job search had kept her away from these monthly family gatherings that her mother coordinated with military precision. The front door opened before she could ring the bell, and her mother, Dr. Linda Chen, appeared in an elegant black dress that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. "Sarah, darling, you made it," her mother said, embracing her briefly before stepping back to examine her appearance with the critical eye of someone who'd spent 30 years as a prominent cardiologist. "You look tired. Are you eating enough? And what's this bag? Don't tell me you're working security somewhere." Sarah forced a smile. "It's good to see you too, Mom. And no, it's not security. I got that promotion I told you about." She followed her mother through the marble foyer, past the family portraits that chronicled 3 generations of Chen family achievements: doctors, lawyers, professors, and successful business owners. Her own military service photos looked somehow out of place among the graduation pictures and professional headshots. The dining room was already full when they entered. Her father, Judge William Chen, sat at the head of the table in his usual position of authority, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed what looked like legal documents even during family time. Her older brother David, a successful investment banker, was showing his phone to their cousin Michael, who worked as a senior partner at a prestigious law firm. Sarah's sister Jennifer, a pediatric surgeon, was discussing a recent medical conference with their aunt, Patricia Chen, who ran her own dermatology practice. "Look who finally decided to join the family," David announced as Sarah entered the room. "Our little soldier girl has traded in her uniform for a business suit." The condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, the same tone he'd used when they were children, and he wanted to remind her that he was 3 years older and infinitely wiser. Sarah took her seat at the table, the same chair she'd occupied since childhood, positioned between her teenage cousins Emma and Tyler. It struck her as symbolic, always treated like the kid's sister, never quite measuring up to the family's expectations of success. "Actually, I've been out of the military for 2 years now," she said calmly, unfolding her napkin. "I've been working in the private sector." "Oh, that's right," Jennifer said, not looking up from her conversation with their aunt. "Didn't you mention something about doing consulting work?" "That's nice, dear. Consulting can be very flexible for transitioning veterans." Sarah felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, but she kept her expression neutral. 5 tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq had taught her to maintain composure under much more hostile conditions than a family dinner. "Actually, I'm not consulting anymore. 3 months ago I accepted a vice president position at Meridian Technologies. The conversation around the table gradually died as her words sank in. David was the first to laugh, a sharp sound that echoed off the crystal chandelier. Vice President? Sarah, come on. You know we support your ambitions, but let's be realistic here. Their father looked up from his documents for the first time since Sarah had arrived. Meridian Technologies? Isn't that the defense contractor that's been all over the news for their financial trouble? Sarah, please tell me you didn't get involved in some kind of pyramid scheme or commissioned sales position. It's not a sales position, Dad. I'm the vice president of operations. I oversee a team of 40 engineers and manage the logistics for 3 major Pentagon contracts worth over $200 million. Sarah's voice remained steady, professional, but she could feel heat rising in her cheek. Michael leaned forward with the expression of someone about to deliver uncomfortable news. Sarah, honey, I appreciate your military service. I really do. But corporate leadership positions at that level require years of business school, MBA credentials, and extensive corporate experience. You can't just walk into a VP role because you served in the military, especially at a company like Meridian, David added, shaking his head sympathetically. I know some people there through my banking connection. Their executive team is all Ivy League, Harvard MBAs, people with serious credentials. No offense, but you went to state school and spent the last decade playing soldier. The phrase playing soldier hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who died saving civilians from an IED blast in Kandahar. She thought about the sleepless nights coordinating supply chains that kept entire forward operating bases operational. She thought about the Bronze Star Medal sitting in a box in her apartment, earned for leading a convoy rescue mission through hostile territory. Her mother reached over and patted her hand gently. Sweetheart, we're not trying to hurt your feelings. We just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of. Sometimes companies use impressive titles to hide lower-level positions. Are you sure you're not thinking of administrative assistant, or maybe operations coordinator? Those are perfectly respectable positions for someone with your background. Sarah looked around the table at the faces of people who claimed to love her, people who were supposed to support her achievement. Instead, she saw polite skepticism, condescending smiles, and the kind of gentle dismissal that hurt more than outright hostility. They weren't being malicious. They genuinely believed they were protecting her from embarrassment. The title is Vice President of Operations, Sarah repeated quietly. I report directly to the CEO. I have my own corner office on the 32nd floor. I make strategic decisions that affect the entire company's defense contract. Tyler, her 17-year-old cousin, looked up from his phone with teenage bluntness. But Sarah, don't you need like an MBA or something for that kind of job? I mean, my guidance counselor says you need specific qualifications for executive position. And there it was. Even her teenage cousin understood something that Sarah apparently didn't. The implication hung in the air like smoke. She simply wasn't qualified for the position she claimed to hold. The silence that followed Tyler's question stretched uncomfortably across the dining room. Sarah could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away the seconds, each sound amplifying the weight of her family's collective doubt. She watched as knowing glances were exchanged around the table, the kind of looks that said, "Poor Sarah doesn't understand how the real world works." Dr. Patricia Chen cleared her throat delicately, her voice taking on the gentle tone typically reserved for delivering bad news to patients. Sarah, dear, I think what everyone is trying to say is that we're concerned about you. After military service, it's common for veterans to have difficulty adjusting to civilian employment standards. There are support groups that can help with these transitions. Support groups? Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt like she was drowning in a sea of well-intentioned condescension. Judge Chen removed his reading glasses and fixed his daughter with the same stern look he'd used when she was caught sneaking out at 16. Sarah Elizabeth Chen, I've been practicing law for 35 years. I know how corporate hierarchies work. Vice presidents at major defense contractors don't come from nowhere. They have pedigrees. Harvard Business School, Wharton Stanford. They have connections, family networks, previous executive experience. Your father's right, Jennifer added, cutting her salmon with surgical precision. In medicine, You can't just decide to be a department head because you want to be. You need board certifications. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Fellowship training. Years of progressive responsibility. Corporate America works the same way. David leaned back in his chair, with the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything. Look, I deal with these defense companies all the time through my banking work. I know their executive teams personally. These aren't feel-good diversity hire situations. These are serious positions requiring serious qualifications that take decades to develop. The phrase diversity hire cut through Sarah like shrapnel. She thought about the selection process at Meridian, the grueling interviews, the detailed presentations on supply chain optimization, the case studies she'd solved that had impressed even the skeptical board members. She thought about CEO Robert Hamilton telling her that her military logistics expertise was exactly what they needed to salvage their failing defense contract. I earned this position, Sarah said quietly, but her words seemed to disappear into the elegant dining room's thick carpet and heavy drapes. Michael reached for the wine bottle, playing the role of the reasonable voice of experience. Sarah, I'm sure you impressed them with your military background. Veterans bring valuable discipline and work ethic to civilian roles, but let's be honest about what's really happening here. You're probably in some kind of management trainee program that they're calling a VP position to make it sound more attractive. Or maybe it's a contractor position with an inflated title, David suggested, warming to his theory. A lot of companies do that now. They hire military consultants as independent contractors and give them fancy business cards to make them feel important. It's cheaper than hiring real executives, and you don't have to provide benefits. Emma, Sarah's 19-year-old cousin who was home from her sophomore year at Yale, finally spoke up. I'm studying business administration, and we just covered corporate structure in my organizational behavior class. VP positions typically require an MBA plus at least 10 years of progressive management experience. The professor said, it's almost impossible to jump directly into senior leadership without working your way up through the ranks. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. Even her teenage cousin was lecturing her about career advancement, based on a sophomore-level business class. She looked around the table at her accomplished family, doctors who had saved thousands of lives, a federal judge who had shaped legal precedent, a banker who managed multi-billion-dollar portfolios, a lawyer who had never lost a major case. In their world of credentials and established hierarchies, her path to success made no sense. Sarah, her mother said gently, we love you and we're proud of your military service, but sweetie, you have to understand that the business world is different from the military. In the military, they promote based on time in service and completion of training programs. In corporate America, it's about education, connections, and paying your dues. That's exactly right, Dr. Patricia nodded. When I wanted to expand from general practice to dermatology, I couldn't just decide to be a dermatologist. I had to go back to school, complete a residency, get board certified. It took years of additional training beyond medical school. Sarah's father leaned forward, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining complex legal concepts to clients. Sweetheart, I'm not saying you can't have a successful business career, but you need to be realistic about starting point. Maybe this company is offering you an entry-level management position with room for growth. There's nothing wrong with starting at the bottom and working your way up honestly, especially in your 30s, Jennifer added. You're still young enough to build a real career if you approach it strategically, but you can't skip steps just because you want to. Tyler looked up from his phone again, his teenage wisdom cutting through the adult conversation. Maybe you misunderstood the job description. Sometimes companies use confusing titles, like my manager at the movie theater is called a guest experience coordinator, but he's really just in charge of cleaning the bathroom. The comparison between her position at a major defense contractor and Tyler's part-time job at a movie theater would have been laughable if it weren't so completely representative of how her family viewed her capability. Sarah felt something cold settling in her stomach, not anger exactly, but a familiar sensation she remembered from her early days in the Marines, when drill instructors questioned whether she had what it took to make it through basic training. I'm telling you the truth about my position, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. I am the Vice President of Operations at Meridian Technologies. I manage critical defense contracts. I make decisions that affect national security projects. David actually chuckled, shaking his head with fond exasperation. Sarah, come on. Listen to yourself. You're talking about national security decisions. Do you really think the Pentagon trusts someone with a state school degree and no business experience to manage their critical defense contracts? That's what I'm trying to understand, Michael said, genuinely puzzled. How exactly did you even get an interview for this supposed position? Corporate recruiting for executive roles typically happens through headhunter firms that work exclusively with Ivy League MBA programs and established corporate executives. Sarah thought about the day Robert Hamilton had called her personally after reading the white paper she'd published on military logistics optimization. She remembered his excitement when he realized that her combat experience in managing supply chains under hostile conditions was exactly what Meridian needed to fix their catastrophic project management failure. But sitting at this table surrounded by her family's absolute certainty that she was either lying or deluded, that conversation felt like something she might have imagined. Maybe it's one of those veteran outreach programs, Jennifer suggested kindly. Some companies have diversity initiatives where they bring in veterans for mentorship roles or advisory positions. Those can be really valuable for gaining business experience. That makes sense, their mother agreed, relief evident in her voice. Sarah probably got selected for a leadership development program and they're calling the participants vice presidents to boost their confidence. That's actually quite thoughtful of the company. Sarah watched her family construct their alternative reality where her success was impossible, where her achievements had to be explained away as charity or misunderstanding. They couldn't conceive of a world where their little sister, the one who had chosen the military over medical school, who had spent her 20s in combat zones, instead of graduate programs, could have genuinely earned a position that they considered above her station. The most devastating part wasn't their disbelief, it was their kindness. They weren't trying to hurt her, they genuinely believed they were saving her from embarrassment, protecting her from a harsh reality they assumed she was too naive to understand. In their minds, they were being loving family members gently guiding her back to earth before she got too attached to an impossible dream. But as Sarah sat there surrounded by their concerned faces and gentle corrections, she felt the same steel resolve that had carried her through 5 combat deployments beginning to crystallize in her chest. Tomorrow was Monday, and she had a board meeting where she would be presenting the strategic reorganization plan that could save Meridian Technologies from bankruptcy. She had spent the last 3 months proving herself to skeptical Pentagon officials and hard-nosed defense contractors who cared only about results. Her family was about to learn what those Pentagon officials already knew. Sarah Chen didn't just survive challenges, she conquered them. The conversation continued around Sarah as if she weren't there, her family members building their collective narrative about her confusion regarding her actual job responsibility. She cut her salmon mechanically, barely tasting the expensive meal as their words washed over her like background noise. Years of military training had taught her to remain calm under fire, but this felt different, more personal, more cutting than any enemy attack she'd faced overseas. I bet it's a program coordinator position, David said confidently, swirling his wine glass. They probably handle scheduling and logistics for real executives. Companies love to give those roles fancy titles to help veterans feel valued. Emma nodded enthusiastically, eager to contribute her newfangled college knowledge. My business ethics professor talked about this exact thing. Companies inflate job titles for veterans because they feel guilty about hiring discrimination. It's like affirmative action but for military people. That's actually quite progressive of them, Dr. Patricia observed. Sarah, you should be grateful that this company is willing to invest in veterans' transition programs. Even if the actual responsibilities are entry-level, it's good experience. Sarah set down her fork and looked directly at her father. Dad, remember when you were appointed to the federal bench? You were only 42, younger than most federal judges. Did people tell you that you weren't qualified? Judge Chen straightened in his chair, his expression growing stern. That's completely different, Sarah. I had a law degree from Columbia, 15 years of trial experience, and 3 Supreme Court clerkships. I'd argued cases before the appellate court dozens of times. My qualifications were unquestionable, but some people did question them. Sarah Pratt. I remember reading the newspaper articles when you were nominated. Some lawyers said you were too young, that you hadn't paid your dues sufficiently. A few political opponents made noise for the cameras, her father admitted grudgingly, but my credentials spoke for themselves. Bar associations endorsed me, senior judges vouched for my competence. That's how professional advancement works in legitimate fields. Jennifer leaned forward, her surgeon's instincts sensing where Sarah was trying to lead the conversation. Sarah, please don't compare Dad's judicial appointment to whatever situation you're in. Dad's achievements were documented, verified, and publicly recognized by his peers. My achievements are documented too, Sarah said quietly. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, 5 combat deployment ribbons, Commendation for Excellence in Military Logistics. I published papers on supply chain management that are still used in military training programs. Michael waved dismissive. Military awards are wonderful for what they are, but they don't translate to corporate leadership qualifications. It's like comparing apples and oranges. A Bronze Star doesn't teach you how to manage profit margins or negotiate corporate contracts. Tyler looked up from his phone with the earnest confusion of youth. But Sarah, if you're really a vice president, wouldn't you be making like a huge salary? I looked it up. VPs at big companies make like $500,000 a year. You're not even wearing designer clothes or driving a nice car. The observation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She looked down at her navy blazer from Macy's, her sensible Honda in the driveway, her practical leather shoes that had cost less than her mother's appetizer. In her family's world, success was measured by visible luxury, the right brands, the right neighborhoods, the right social circles. Some people don't need to flaunt their success, Sarah said, but even she could hear how defensive it sounded. David laughed, not unkindly. Sarah, come on. If you were making VP money, you'd at least be able to afford a decent car. That Honda has got to be 8 years old. Maybe the company gives fancy titles instead of real salaries, Emma suggested, like they make you feel important, but don't actually pay executive wages. It's like being named Employee of the Month. Nice for your ego, but it doesn't change your actual job. Their mother reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand with the gentle firmness of someone delivering difficult but necessary medicine. Sweetheart, I think what everyone is trying to say is that we're worried about you. After years in the military, it can be hard to understand how civilian career advancement really works. Exactly, Dr. Patricia nodded. Military advancement is very structured. You follow a clear progression based on time and training. Corporate America is much more competitive and political. It's not enough to be competent. You need the right background, the right connections, the right cultural fit. Sarah felt herself sliding into a familiar mental space, the same zone she'd entered during ambushes in Afghanistan when everything slowed down and her training took over. She began to notice details with crystalline clarity, the way her brother's wedding ring caught the light as he gestured dismissively, the sound of her sister's precise breathing between her patronizing comments, the smell of her mother's expensive perfume mixed with disappointment. I need to use the restroom, Sarah said suddenly, standing from the table. Excuse me. She walked through the familiar hallways of her childhood home, past the gallery of family achievements that had always made her feel inadequate. In the powder room, she stared at herself in the mirror that had once reflected a confused teenager trying to figure out where she fit in this family of high achievers. Now she saw something different. A woman who had led Marines through combat, who had made life and death decisions under pressure, who had earned the respect of some of the most demanding military leaders in the world. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Robert Hamilton, Meridian's CEO. Sarah, I know it's Sunday evening, but the Pentagon just called. General Morrison wants to meet with you personally on Tuesday to discuss expanding the logistics contract. Your presentation on supply chain optimization has them very interested. This could be huge for the company. Hope you're enjoying your family time. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment. General Morrison, a 3-star general she'd worked with during her final deployment, someone who had personally recommended her for her current position. The same General Morrison who had told her that her innovative approaches to military logistics were exactly what the defense industry needed to drag itself into the 21st century. She thought about the presentation she'd given to Meridian's board of directors 3 months ago, when she'd outlined how her combat experience managing supply chains under hostile conditions could revolutionize their approach to defense contracts. She remembered the moment when the skeptical board members realized that her unconventional background wasn't a liability, it was exactly the competitive advantage they needed. But as she returned to the dining room, none of that seemed to matter. Her family had moved on to discussing Jennifer's latest medical conference, their conversation flowing around the empty space where Sarah's credibility should have been. They had collectively decided that her claims were impossible, and no amount of explanation would change their mind. "Sarah," her father said as she sat down, "we've been talking, and we think you should consider enrolling in an MBA program. I could make some calls, help you get into a good school. With your military background, you might even qualify for veterans' educational benefit." "That's a wonderful idea," their mother agreed enthusiastically, "and in the meantime, you could look for a more realistic position at this company, maybe in their administrative department, or human resources. Those are perfectly respectable career paths for someone with your background." David nodded approvingly. "Absolutely, and Sarah, there's no shame in starting over. Lots of veterans struggle with the transition to civilian careers. The important thing is being honest about your current skill level, and working systematically to improve." Sarah looked around the table at these people who claimed to love her, who were systematically dismantling her achievements with the best of intentions. They weren't malicious, they genuinely believed they were helping her. In their world of traditional credentials and established hierarchies, her success story simply didn't compute. But tomorrow was Monday, and she had work to do, real work with real consequences, for real Pentagon contracts that would either succeed or fail based on her decision. Her family might not believe in her qualifications, but fortunately, the United States military did. The question was, how long could she sit at this table, listening to people she loved, explain why her life was impossible, before she decided to show them exactly what impossible looked like? The dessert course arrived with the same precision that characterized everything in the Chen household. Individual chocolate soufflés served on bone china plates that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly grocery budget. She watched her family dive into the elegant desserts while continuing their discussion about her situation, as they had begun calling it with the delicate euphemism typically reserved for discussing someone's terminal illness. "I have a colleague whose son went through something similar," Dr. Tricia said, between bites of soufflé. "He came back from Iraq convinced he was going to be a police chief, but it turned out he was just working dispatch." Military service can sometimes create unrealistic expectations about civilian authority structures. Uma nodded sagely, her Yale sophomore wisdom adding weight to the conversation. "We studied this in my psychology class. It's called role confusion. Veterans sometimes have trouble adjusting to civilian hierarchies because military rank doesn't transfer to corporate settings." "That's exactly right," Michael agreed. "In the military, if you're a captain, everyone below you has to follow orders. But in corporate America, influence is based on education, connections, and proven business results. You can't just command respect, you have to earn it through traditional channels." Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, a familiar sensation she remembered from her first firefight in Afghanistan when she realized that all her training was about to be tested under actual combat conditions. The polite conversation around the dessert table was starting to feel like psychological warfare, death by 1,000 small cuts of loving condescension. "Sarah, dear," her mother said gently, "I've been thinking about this all evening, and I believe I understand what happened. You probably interviewed for an administrative position and impressed them with your military bearing. So they gave you a fancy title and some supervisory responsibilities to make you feel valued. It's actually quite thoughtful of them." Judge Chen set down his dessert spoon with the finality of someone rendering a verdict. "The bottom line is, this legitimate corporate vice president positions are earned through decades of progressive advancement. They require MBA credentials, proven profit and loss responsibility, and a track record of managing significant business operations. These aren't participation trophies, Sarah." "Exactly," David said, warming to his theme. I know VPs at major corporations. They're Harvard MBAs, who started as analysts, worked their way up to associate, then manager, then director, then senior director, and finally VP. It's a 15-year minimum progression. You can't just skip to the end because you served in the military. Tyler looked up from his phone with the brutal honesty that only teenagers could deliver. Plus, Sarah, no offense, but you don't really seem like executive material. Like you're nice and all, but VPs are supposed to be super intimidating and confident. You're more like norm. The comment hit harder than any of the others because it came without malice. Just the honest observation of a 17-year-old who had never learned to filter his thoughts. Sarah realized that even her own family saw her as fundamentally ordinary. Someone who could be a decent employee, but never a leader. I think Tyler's onto something, Jennifer said thoughtfully. Executive presence is a real thing. It's about commanding authority, making tough decisions, projecting confidence under pressure. Sarah, you're wonderful, but you've always been more of a follower than a natural leader. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. If her sister only knew about the time Sarah had led a convoy rescue mission through hostile territory, making split-second decisions that saved 12 lives while under direct enemy fire. But that version of herself, Captain Chen, the combat leader, who had earned the respect of hardened Marines through pure competence, seemed to exist in a different universe from this dining room, where she was being gently explained to like a confused child. Maybe we should visit this company, her mother suggested suddenly. I'd love to meet your supervisor and get a better understanding of your actual responsibilities. Sometimes it helps to have family involved in career transitions. The suggestion sent ice through Sarah's veins. She imagined her mother showing up at Meridian Technologies, asking to speak to Sarah's real boss because surely her daughter couldn't actually be in charge of anything important. She pictured her family's reaction when they discovered that Sarah's supervisor was Robert Hamilton, the CEO who had personally recruited her and regularly sought her strategic advice. That's not necessary, Sarah said quickly. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own career. Of course you are, sweetheart, her father said with the patronizing tone he typically used with confused defendants. But there's nothing wrong with family support. When I was starting my legal career, your grandfather helped me understand the political aspects of the profession that they don't teach in law school. The difference is that Dad actually had proper qualifications, David pointed out. Sarah's trying to navigate corporate waters without the basic credentials everyone else has. She needs more help, not less. Emma leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who had just solved a complex puzzle. You know what I think happened? I bet Sarah interviewed for some kind of consulting position, and during the interview process, they used terms like you'll be working at the VP level, or reporting to the VP of operations. She probably misunderstood and thought they were offering her the VP position itself. That makes perfect sense, Dr. Patricia agreed. Communication breakdowns are common during job transitions. Sarah probably heard what she wanted to hear rather than what was actually being offered. Michael nodded approvingly. It's like when I interview paralegals and tell them they'll be working with senior partners, they're not becoming senior partners. They're supporting senior partners. The distinction is crucial. Sarah watched her family construct their alternative reality with the methodical precision of surgeons removing a tumor. Every piece of evidence that contradicted their narrative was explained away, rationalized or dismissed as misunderstanding. They couldn't accept that their assumptions about her capabilities might be wrong, so they had to make her reality wrong instead. I need to make a phone call, Sarah said suddenly, standing from the table. Work emergency. She walked to the kitchen, pulled out her phone and stared at Robert Hamilton's text message again. General Morrison wanted to meet with her personally. A 3-star general who had commanded entire theaters of operation, wanted to discuss expanding contracts based on her recommendation. The same military leader who had written her recommendation letter for her current position, stating that Captain Chen was one of the most innovative logistics minds he had encountered in 30 years of service. Sarah scrolled through her recent emails on her phone. There was a message from the Pentagon's Defense Logistics Agency asking for her input on a new supply chain initiative. another from a major defense contractor requesting a consultation on their overseas operation, a third from Harvard Business School inviting her to speak at their Veterans Leadership Symposium about non-traditional paths to executive success. But standing in her childhood kitchen, surrounded by the comfortable sounds of her family continuing their dinner conversation in the next room, all of those external validations felt somehow insubstantial. These were the people who had known her since birth, who had watched her grow up, who understood her real capabilities better than anyone else. If they couldn't believe in her success, maybe she was the one who was confused. Or maybe, Sarah thought as she listened to her brother explaining to Tyler why military experience wasn't relevant to business leadership, it was time to stop trying to convince them with words. Tomorrow was Monday, and she had a company to help save from bankruptcy. Her family would either believe in her accomplishments when they saw the results, or they would find new ways to explain them away. But first, she had to survive the rest of this dinner without completely losing her mind. As she returned to the dining room, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She was going to stop defending herself and start documenting everything, because sooner or later her family was going to discover that their little Sarah was much more than they had ever imagined. Sarah returned to the dining room to find her family deep in animated conversation about career development strategies, their voices carrying the enthusiasm of people who had discovered a fascinating problem to solve. She slipped back into her chair as her mother was explaining the benefits of professional mentorship programs for transitioning veterans. The key is realistic goal setting, Judge Chen was saying, using his courtroom voice to emphasize important points. Sarah needs to understand that corporate success requires patience and systematic advancement. You can't just decide to be an executive any more than you can decide to be a Supreme Court justice. Absolutely, Jennifer agreed, her surgical precision extending to career advice. In medicine, we have very clear progression pathways: medical school, residency, fellowship, attending physician, department head, chief of staff. Each step has specific requirements and timelines. Corporate America works the same way. David pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. You know what? I'm going to look up this Meridian Technologies company right now. Let's see what they actually do and what their real executive team looks like. His fingers moved across the screen with the confidence of someone about to prove a point. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She knew exactly what David would find. Meridian's website featured her professional headshot prominently on their leadership page, along with her military background and current responsibility. But she also knew her family well enough to predict that they would find ways to explain away even photographic evidence of her position. Here we go, David announced triumphantly. Meridian Technologies, defense contractor, headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. Founded in 1987, specializes in military logistics and supply chain management. He scrolled through the website with the thoroughness of someone conducting financial due diligence. Revenue approximately $400 million annually. Contracts with Navy, Army and Air Force. Emma leaned over to look at David's phone screen. Wow, that's actually a pretty big company. I thought it would be some tiny startup or something. Let me see their executive team, David continued, navigating to the leadership page. Sarah watched his expression change as he found her photograph and biography. His confident smile faltered slightly, replaced by confusion, then what looked like genuine surprise. That's interesting, he said slowly, staring at the screen. There's actually a Sarah Chen listed as Vice President of Operations. He turned the phone toward the rest of the family, his voice uncertain for the first time all evening. This is your picture, Sarah. The conversation around the table died suddenly. Sarah watched her family members lean forward to examine David's phone, their expressions shifting from skeptical amusement to puzzled concentration. She could almost see their mental gears turning as they tried to reconcile this new information with their established narrative. Well, that's her picture, their mother said carefully. But that doesn't necessarily mean, anyone can put a picture on a website. Mom, this is their official corporate website, David said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. It says she has an MBA from Georgetown, an extensive military logistics experience. It lists her as responsible for 3 major Pentagon contracts worth over $200 million. Tyler grabbed the phone from his uncle, scrolling through Sarah's biography with teenage fascination. Holy crap. Sorry, Grandma, but this says she has a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. Sarah, you never told us you were wounded in action. Language. Tyler. Dr. Patricia corrected automatically, but her attention was focused on the phone screen. Sarah, when did you get an MBA from Georgetown? I thought you only had your undergraduate engineering degree. Sarah had been dreading this moment for months. I completed the MBA through their executive program for military officers during my final deployment. I worked on it evenings and weekends for 2 years while I was still active duty. The information landed on the table like a grenade with the pin pulled. Sarah could see her family members exchanging glances, their carefully constructed narrative beginning to crack under the weight of documented evidence. But rather than accepting the new information, they began working to explain it away. Executive programs are different from traditional MBAs, Michael said quickly, his lawyer instincts kicking in. They're usually designed for working professionals who can't commit to full-time study. The admission standards are more flexible. Exactly, Jennifer agreed, relief evident in her voice. And Georgetown probably has special programs for veterans. It's part of their diversity initiatives. Those programs are wonderful, but they're not equivalent to traditional business school. Emma was still scrolling through the website, her expression growing more confused by the minute. But guys, look at this. It says she led a team that saved the company $15 million last quarter by restructuring their overseas supply chain. There's a quote from the CEO saying she's revolutionizing how we approach defense logistics. Websites can say anything, their father observed, his judicial skepticism in full force. Companies exaggerate employee achievements all the time for marketing purposes. They probably took some minor efficiency improvement and inflated it for public relations. David was conducting his own investigation, cross-referencing information with the focused intensity he typically reserved for analyzing investment portfolio. I'm looking at some defense industry publications, and Sarah's name keeps coming up. There's an article in Defense Weekly from last month about innovative logistics solutions, and she's quoted extensively. Trade publications love to interview anyone with a military background, Patricia explained patiently. It gives their articles credibility with readers. That doesn't mean she's actually making high-level strategic decisions. Sarah watched her family perform intellectual gymnastics to maintain their original assessment of her capability. Each piece of evidence was met with increasingly elaborate explanations about why it didn't mean what it appeared to mean. They couldn't simply admit that they had been wrong about her qualifications, so they had to make the evidence wrong instead. You know, Sarah said quietly, pulling out her own phone. Let me show you something. She scrolled to her recent emails and found the message from General Morrison's aide. I received this an hour ago. She read aloud. Chen, General Morrison requests a meeting Tuesday at 0800 to discuss your recommendations for expanding the Joint Logistics Command contract. The general was impressed by your strategic analysis and wants to explore implementing your supply chain innovations across additional military installations. Please confirm your availability. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in conversation. This wasn't polite skepticism or gentle correction. This was genuine confusion from people whose worldview was being challenged by information they couldn't easily dismiss. A 3-star general wants to meet with you personally, Jennifer asked, her voice smaller than usual. General Morrison commanded the logistics operations for the entire Middle East theater during my last deployment, Sarah explained. He's the one who recommended me for my current position. When he heard that Meridian was looking for someone with combat logistics experience, Tyler looked up from David's phone with the wide-eyed expression of someone discovering that their boring aunt was actually a secret agent. Sarah, this is actually kind of awesome. Why didn't you ever tell us any of this stuff? Sarah looked around the table at her family members, who were all staring at her with expressions ranging from confusion to what might have been the beginning of respect. For the first time all evening, the balance of authority in the room had shifted. They were no longer explaining her life to her. They were trying to understand how they had misjudged the situation so completely. But Sarah knew her family well enough to predict what would happen next. They would find new ways to minimize her achievements, new explanations for why her success wasn't quite what it appeared to be. Because accepting that their little sister had genuinely earned a position they considered beyond her capabilities would require them to question everything they thought they knew about merit, qualifications, and their own assumptions about success. The real test wouldn't be convincing them that her business cards were authentic. It would be proving that she deserved the respect those cards represented. The transformation in the dining room's atmosphere was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah could feel the shift in her family's attention, like the moment in combat when enemy forces suddenly realize they've underestimated their opponent. But she also recognized the expression on their faces, the same look her drill instructors had worn when confronted with evidence that contradicted their initial assessments. They weren't ready to surrender their narrative without a fight. "I'm still having trouble understanding this timeline," Judge Chen said, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when cross-examining witnesses whose testimony seemed inconsistent. "Sarah, you're saying you completed an MBA, earned these military commendations, and landed a vice president position all without any of us knowing about it." "I mentioned the MBA program several times," Sarah replied calmly. "I talked about taking online classes during my deployment. I sent you pictures of my graduation ceremony." Her mother's expression flickered with what might have been recognition. "Oh, that little ceremony you had on the base? I thought that was just some military training completion thing. You never said it was actually a master's degree." "You never asked," Sarah said simply. David was still scrolling through his phone, his banker's instincts driving him to verify every claim through multiple sources. "I'm looking at LinkedIn, and Sarah's profile shows progression from military officer to defense consultant to her current VP role. The timeline actually makes sense if you follow the defense industry connection." "LinkedIn profiles can be fabricated," Michael pointed out, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Anyone can claim any position they want on social media." Emma looked up from her own phone where she'd been conducting her own research. "But Uncle Mike, I'm looking at actual news articles. There's a piece in the Washington Post from 6 months ago about women veterans in executive roles, and Sarah is featured prominently. They interviewed her about breaking barriers in the defense industry." "The Washington Post," Patricia repeated, her skepticism wavering. As someone who had been featured in medical journals herself, she understood the credibility that came with legitimate media coverage. Tyler was reading over Emma's shoulder, his teenage enthusiasm building as he discovered more information. "This is so cool. Sarah, it says here that you testified before Congress about military logistics reform. You actually spoke to Congress." "It was a House subcommittee hearing on defense procurement," Sarah explained. "They asked me to provide expert testimony on supply chain vulnerabilities in overseas operations." The weight of accumulated evidence was beginning to crack her family's collective search. Sarah could see doubt creeping into their expressions, the first signs that their protective narrative might be wrong, but she also knew that acknowledgement of error would be difficult for people who had built their identities around being right about everything. "I suppose it's possible," Jennifer said slowly, "that we may have underestimated the value of Sarah's military experience in the private sector, but surely this is an unusual case. Most veterans don't transition directly into executive role. Most veterans don't have Sarah's specific combination of combat logistics experience and advanced education," David admitted grudgingly. "The defense industry might value that background more than traditional corporate sectors would." Sarah watched her brother work through the logical implications of the evidence, his analytical mind forcing him to adjust his conclusions despite his emotional resistance. She could see him beginning to accept that his little sister might actually be more accomplished than he had assumed. "But why didn't you tell us about any of this?" their mother asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "Sarah, if you've achieved all these things, why have you been so secretive about your success?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Sarah looked around the table at these people who claimed to love her, who had spent the entire evening explaining why her achievements were impossible, and tried to find words for a truth that was too painful to speak directly. "I tried to tell you," she said quietly. "Every time I mentioned my work, you dismissed it. Every time I shared good news, you explained why it wasn't what I thought it was. After a while, I stopped trying." The accusation landed with the force of a physical blow. Sarah could see her family members processing the implications of her words, beginning to understand how their protective skepticism had morphed into something more damaging. "We were just trying to help," Judge Chen said defensively. "We know how difficult the transition from military to civilian life can be. We didn't want you to get hurt by unrealistic expectations." Whose expectations were unrealistic? Sarah asked, her voice still calm but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. Mine, or yours? David set down his phone and looked directly at his sister for the first time all evening. Sarah, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on, I don't know what, habit. Maybe, the way I've always seen you. We all did, Jennifer admitted reluctantly. But in our defense, this is a very unusual career trajectory. Most people don't jump from military service directly into senior corporate leadership. Most people aren't, Sarah, Tyler said with the blunt honesty that only teenagers could deliver. I mean, she's been like a secret badass this whole time and we just never noticed. Emma was still reading articles on her phone, her expression growing more amazed by the minute. There's a whole profile piece here about Sarah's innovations in combat logistics. It says she developed new supply chain protocols that are now being used throughout the military. That's actually incredible. Dr. Patricia cleared her throat delicately. Sarah, dear, I think what everyone is trying to say is that we may have misjudged the situation. Your achievements are clearly more substantial than we initially understood. The careful phrasing, misjudged the situation rather than were completely wrong about you, was so typically her family that Sarah almost smiled. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence, they couldn't quite bring themselves to admit the full extent of their error. The question is, Michael said, his lawyer's mind already moving toward damage control. How do we move forward from here? Sarah, you must be feeling frustrated with our lack of support. Sarah considered her response carefully. She could accept their grudging acknowledgement and pretend that everything was fine. She could be gracious in victory and allow them to save face. But 5 tours of duty had taught her that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought after the shooting stopped. I need you to understand something, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed while commanding Marines in combat. This isn't about you being wrong about my job title, this is about you being wrong about me. The statement hit the table like a precision strike. Sarah could see her family members shifting uncomfortably as they began to grasp the deeper implications of the evening's revelation. For 31 years, you've seen me as the family screw-up, the one who chose the military instead of medical school, who couldn't quite measure up to your standards of success. Tonight proved that your assessment of my capabilities was fundamentally flawed. Judge Chen opened his mouth to object, but Sarah continued with the relentless momentum of someone who had finally decided to speak her truth. The question isn't whether you believe in my current job. The question is whether you're capable of seeing me as anything other than your disappointing little sister who needs constant guidance and protection from her own poor judgment. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah had finally said what needed to be said, and her family was left to confront the uncomfortable reality of their own limitation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove herself. But tonight had established something more important: the terms under which their future relationship would be conducted. Sarah Chen, Vice President of Operations, was done apologizing for her success. The silence stretched across the dining room like a battlefield after the smoke clears. Heavy with the weight of truths that couldn't be taken back, Sarah watched her family members grapple with the implications of her words, their faces cycling through expressions of surprise, defensiveness, and what might have been the beginning of genuine reflection. Tyler, with the fearless honesty that came from not yet learning to filter uncomfortable observations, was the first to break the silence. Honestly, this explains a lot. I always wondered why Sarah seemed so different when she came back from the military. Like, more confident or something. But you guys always talked about her like she was still the same person from high school. Emma nodded slowly, her Yale education apparently including courses in family dynamics. It's like we've been treating Sarah like she's frozen in time. But obviously military service changes people, especially combat experience. Judge Chen shifted in his chair, his judicial instincts struggling with evidence that contradicted his long-held verdict. Sarah, I want you to understand that our concerns came from a place of love. We've seen veterans struggle with unrealistic expectations during their transitions to civilian life. Dad, Sarah said quietly, when exactly did you decide that I was incapable of accurately assessing my own career situation? Was it when I graduated summa cum laude from engineering school, when I completed ranger training, when I led Marines through 5 combat deployments. At what point did you conclude that I couldn't be trusted to understand my own professional reality? The questions hit like precision artillery strikes, each one targeting a specific assumption her family had made about her competence. Sarah could see her father processing the logic of her argument, his legal mind forced to confront the weakness of his position. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Sarah remembered from their childhood when he'd been caught in some elaborate lie. You're right. I've been thinking about this all wrong. I kept comparing your path to traditional corporate advancement, but that's not fair. The defense industry obviously values different qualifications. It's not just the defense industry, Sarah replied. It's about recognizing that there are multiple paths to success, and that my path might be different from yours without being inferior to yours. Patricia dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, her composure finally cracking. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I realize now that we've been incredibly patronizing. When you tried to share your achievements, we dismissed them because they didn't fit our understanding of how success works. Jennifer set down her dessert spoon with surgical precision, her analytical mind working through the implications. The truth is, we've been protecting our own egos as much as yours. It's easier to assume you're confused than to admit that you've accomplished things we don't fully understand. The admission was so unexpected that Sarah felt something shift in her chest, not quite forgiveness, but perhaps the beginning of a path toward it. She looked around the table at these people who had shaped her understanding of worth and achievement, and for the first time in years, she saw them clearly as flawed human beings, rather than towering authorities, whose approval she desperately needed. I need you to understand what tonight has cost me, Sarah said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel that her family was hearing for the first time. I came here excited to share my success with the people I love most. Instead, I spent 3 hours having my achievements explained away by people who refused to believe I could have earned them. Her mother reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of Sarah's. Sweetheart, how can we fix this? How can we show you that we believe in you now? Sarah looked at her mother's outstretched hand, then at the faces around the table, faces that now showed genuine remorse, mixed with uncertainty about how to move forward. The question was fair but complex. How do you rebuild trust with people who have spent years undermining your confidence while claiming to protect you? I don't need you to believe in me now, Sarah said finally. I needed you to believe in me when it was hard to believe, when my path didn't make sense to you, when my success challenged your assumptions about how the world works. That ship has sailed. The words hit the table like a gavel, final and unforgiving. Sarah could see the impact on her family's faces, the recognition that some damage couldn't be easily repaired with apologies and good intentions. Michael cleared his throat, his lawyer's instincts searching for a way to negotiate a better outcome. Sarah, what would need to happen for us to rebuild your trust? What would demonstrate that we've learned from this mistake? Sarah considered the question seriously. These people had raised her, supported her education, celebrated her military service, and then systematically undermined her confidence in her own achievement. The pattern spoke to something deeper than simple misunderstanding. It revealed fundamental assumptions about her capabilities that had shaped decades of family interactions. I need you to examine why you were so invested in being right about my limitations. Tonight wasn't about protecting me from disappointment. It was about protecting yourselves from having to acknowledge that your assessment of my potential was wrong. Tyler looked around the table with the confused expression of someone trying to follow an adult conversation that had moved beyond his understanding. So wait. Are we not going to have normal family dinners anymore? Because this got really intense really fast. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling at her cousin's bewildered practicality. Tyler, we're going to have exactly the kind of family dinners we've always had. The only difference is that I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not to make other people comfortable. Emma was still scrolling through articles on her phone, her academic curiosity driving her to understand the full scope of what had been revealed. Sarah, this article says you're speaking at the National Defense University next month about innovative logistics strategies. That's really impressive. Yes, it is, Sarah agreed simply, without false modesty or the self-deprecating deflection she'd learned to use around her family. I've worked hard to become an expert in my field, and people in that field recognize my expertise. Judge Chen straightened in his chair, his judicial bearing asserting itself as he tried to regain some authority in a conversation that had slipped beyond his control. Sarah, I want you to know that we're proud of your achievement. We may have expressed our concerns poorly, but our love for you has never been in question. Sarah met her father's eyes directly, holding his gaze with the same steady confidence she'd used when briefing generals on combat operations. Dad, love without respect isn't enough. And respect means accepting that I'm capable of making sound decisions about my own life, even when those decisions don't make sense to you. The statement hung in the air between them, a challenge and an invitation simultaneously. Sarah had finally articulated the terms under which their relationship could continue, not as the confused child seeking approval from wise adults, but as an accomplished woman demanding recognition from her peer. Her phone buzzed against the table and Sarah glanced down to see another message from Robert Hamilton. Sarah, just got off the phone with the Pentagon. They want to fast-track the contract expansion based on your recommendation. Can you come in early tomorrow to prep for the General Morrison meeting? This is going to be huge for the company. Sarah showed the message to her family without comment. She was done explaining herself, done defending her achievements, done seeking their validation for accomplishments that spoke for themselves. Tomorrow she would return to a world where her expertise was valued and her judgment was trusted. Tonight had been a reckoning. Tomorrow would be a reminder of why their opinion of her capabilities had stopped mattering long ago. The message from Robert Hamilton seemed to glow on Sarah's phone screen, a tangible reminder of the world that existed beyond this dining room, a world where her decisions affected million-dollar contracts, and her advice shaped national defense strategy. She watched her family read the text, their expressions shifting as the reality of her professional importance became impossible to ignore. The Pentagon wants to fast-track something based on your recommendation, David asked, his voice carrying a new note of respect that hadn't been there an hour earlier. Sarah, that's actually incredible. Emma looked up from her own phone where she'd been cross-referencing the names mentioned in the text. Robert Hamilton is the CEO of Meridian Technologies. I found his bio. He's like a really big deal in the defense industry. And he's texting Sarah directly about Pentagon meetings. On a Sunday night, Jennifer observed, her medical training making her notice the urgency implied by weekend communication. That suggests your input is critical to whatever they're planning. Sarah typed a quick response confirming her availability for the early meeting, her fingers moving with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. General Morrison commanded the largest logistics operation in military history during the Afghan withdrawal. When he asks for your recommendations on supply chain improvements, you don't keep him waiting. The casual mention of her connection to such high-level military leadership landed on the table like another piece of evidence in a case that was already decided. Sarah could see her family struggling to integrate this new information with their long-held assumptions about her place in the world. Tyler was staring at his cousin with the expression of someone discovering that their boring relative was actually a secret superhero. Sarah, this is insane. You're like actually important. Like really important. People I've never heard of but who sound super impressive are asking for your opinion on stuff I can't even pronounce. It's not insane, Tyler, Sarah said gently. It's just work. Important work that I'm qualified to do because I've spent years developing the expertise to do it well. Patricia wiped her eyes again, her emotion becoming more visible as the full scope of the evening's revelations settled in. Sarah, I keep thinking about all the times you tried to tell us about your achievements, and we just didn't listen. We were so convinced we knew better. You listened, Sarah corrected. You just decided that what I was telling you couldn't be true, so you created alternative explanations that made more sense to you. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his lawyer's mind recognizing the precision with which Sarah was dissecting their behavior. That's a fair criticism. We approached your career news with the assumption that you must be misunderstanding something, rather than considering that we might be the ones who didn't understand. Judge Chen cleared his throat, his voice carrying the weight of someone preparing to render a difficult verdict. Sarah, I need to acknowledge something. Tonight has forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my own biases. I made judgments about your capabilities based on outdated information and my own limited understanding of how success works in your field. The admission was significant coming from a man who had built his career on never being wrong about anything. Sarah could see the effort it cost him to acknowledge error, and she felt a flicker of respect for his willingness to confront his own mistake. The thing is, Sarah said, this pattern didn't start tonight. For years you've been explaining my life to me rather than listening to me explain my life to you. Tonight was just the most dramatic example of something that's been happening consistently. Emma was nodding thoughtfully, her young perspective offering clarity that the adults were struggling to achieve. It's like you guys created this version of Sarah in your heads, and then when the real Sarah didn't match that version, you decided the real Sarah must be wrong. That's exactly what happened, David admitted, his banker's analytical skills finally being applied to family dynamics instead of financial markets. We created a narrative about Sarah being the family member who needed guidance and protection, and then we filtered everything through that lens. Sarah stood from the table, her movement drawing everyone's attention. I need to go home and prepare for tomorrow's meeting. General Morrison expects detailed briefing materials on 3 different supply chain scenarios, and I need to review the latest intelligence reports on overseas logistic vulnerability. The casual mention of intelligence reports and general-level briefings served as a final reminder of the gulf between her family's perception of her work and its actual significance. Sarah could see them processing the implications of her responsibilities, the recognition that their little Sarah was trusted with information that affected national security decisions. Will you? Her mother started, then stopped, uncertainty clouding her features. Will you keep us updated on how the meeting goes? I'd like to know if the general approves your recommendations. Sarah paused at the dining room entrance, considering her response. The question represented a shift in their dynamic, her mother asking for information rather than offering advice, seeking updates on achievements rather than explaining why those achievements were impossible. I'll let you know how it goes, Sarah said finally. But Mom, I need you to understand that this is my world now. I'm not a confused veteran who needs career guidance. I'm a defense industry executive who briefs 3-star generals on strategic logistics initiatives. Those are very different things. Tyler raised his hand like he was in a classroom, his teenage directness cutting through the adult complexity. So Sarah, just to be clear, you're actually like really successful and we just didn't know it. I'm successful in ways that matter to me, Sarah replied. Whether you know it or not doesn't change the reality of what I've accomplished. Jennifer stood as well, her surgeon's instincts, recognizing when a procedure was complete. Sarah, I owe you an apology that goes beyond tonight. I've been condescending to you for years without realizing. Your path to success is different from mine, but that doesn't make it less valid. Thank you, Sarah said simply. That means more than you know. As Sarah gathered her purse and jacket, her family remained seated around the table, their dessert forgotten as they grappled with the implications of the evening's revelation. She could feel their eyes on her as she moved through the familiar motions of leaving a family dinner, but everything had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. Sarah, her father called as she reached the front door. I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. Sarah turned back to look at him, this man whose approval she had sought for 3 decades. Thank you, Dad. But I need you to understand, I stopped needing your pride when I started earning my own. The words weren't cruel, just honest. Sarah had finally reached the point where external validation was less important than internal certainty about her own worth. Her family's opinion mattered because she loved them, but it no longer defined her understanding of her own capability. As she walked to her practical Honda in the circular driveway, Sarah felt lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow she would brief a 3-star general on strategic recommendations that could reshape military logistics operations. Tonight, she had finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she had worked so hard to become. The house behind her was lit up like a beacon, filled with people who were just beginning to understand that their assumptions about success, qualification, and achievement might need some serious reconsideration. But that was their work to do, not her. Sarah Chen had a country to help defend, and she was exactly the right person for the job. The drive home through the quiet suburban streets of Westchester, gave Sarah time to process the emotional battlefield she'd just navigated. Streetlights cast long shadows across her windshield as she replayed the evening's conversations, each memory carrying a different weight now that the truth was finally out in the open. Her phone, connected to the car's Bluetooth system, chimed periodically with work emails that she would need to address before tomorrow's critical meeting. At a red light, Sarah glanced at her reflection in the rearview mirror and saw something she hadn't seen in years: the face of Captain Chen looking back at her, the confident military officer who had earned the respect of Marines and generals alike. Somewhere along the way, during family gatherings and subtle dismissals, that woman had retreated behind a mask of polite deference to civilian family members who claimed to know better. Her apartment building came into view, a modest high-rise in Arlington that was convenient to both Pentagon meetings and Meridian's headquarters. As she pulled into her assigned parking spot, Sarah realized that her family's perception of her lifestyle had been another piece of evidence in their case against her success. In their world of inherited wealth and prestigious addresses, her practical choices had been interpreted as limitations rather than priorities. The elevator ride to the 15th floor was accompanied by another chime from her phone. This time it was a message from Colonel Patricia Williams, her former commanding officer who now worked at the Pentagon. "Sarah, heard through the grapevine that you're briefing Morrison tomorrow on the logistics expansion. Just wanted you to know that your reputation precedes you. The general specifically requested you after reading your paper on adaptive supply chains." "Knock 'em dead, Captain." Sarah smiled at the use of her former rank. In military circles, once a captain, always a captain, regardless of current civilian title. Colonel Williams' message was a reminder that her professional reputation existed entirely independent of her family's assessment. In the defense establishment, Sarah Chen was known for innovation, competence, and results that spoke for themselves. Her apartment was spartanly furnished but efficiently organized, reflecting both her military background and her current priorities. The living room served double duty as a home office, with a large monitor displaying real-time logistics data from Meridian's overseas operation. Maps of global supply routes covered one wall, marked with colored pins, indicating strategic choke points and alternative pathways that could be crucial during international crises. Sarah kicked off her practical shoes and immediately switched into work mode, her muscle memory taking over as she prepared for what would likely be the most important briefing of her civilian career. The materials for tomorrow's meeting were spread across her dining table: satellite imagery of shipping routes, classified reports on emerging security threats, and financial projections that would determine whether Meridian survived its current crisis or collapsed under the weight of failed contracts. As she reviewed the intelligence reports, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Robert Hamilton's number, and she answered immediately despite the late hour. "Sarah, I hope I'm not calling too late," came the CEO's voice, tinged with the excitement of someone who had just received game-changing news. "I wanted to give you a heads up about tomorrow's meeting. General Morrison isn't just interested in our current contracts. He wants to discuss making Meridian the Pentagon's primary logistics partner for the entire Pacific Theater." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The Pacific Theater contract would be worth billions of dollars, and would position Meridian as one of the most important defense contractors in the country. It was the kind of opportunity that could define careers and reshape entire companies. "What's the timeline?" Sarah asked, already mentally reorganizing her presentation to address the expanded scope. "That's the thing," Robert continued. "Morrison wants a preliminary assessment by Friday. If he likes what he hears tomorrow, we'll have 4 days to put together a comprehensive proposal for the largest logistics contract in Pentagon history." The magnitude of the opportunity was matched only by its complexity. Sarah would be responsible for designing supply chain solutions that could support military operations across the entire Pacific region, from Japan to Australia, from Hawaii to the Philippines. It was exactly the kind of challenge that would have been impossible without her unique combination of combat experience and strategic planning expertise. "I'll be ready," Sarah said simply, because in her world being ready wasn't optional. After hanging up, Sarah sat in her home office and looked at the wall of maps that had suddenly become much more relevant. Tomorrow's meeting would determine not just Meridian's future, but her own trajectory in the defense industry. Success would establish her as one of the top logistics experts in the country. Failure would validate every doubt her family had ever expressed about her qualification. But, as Sarah began pulling additional files and updating her presentation materials, she realized something important had changed during the evening's confrontation with her family. For the first time in years, their opinion of her capabilities felt irrelevant to her own assessment of the challenge ahead. She wasn't preparing for tomorrow's briefing to prove anything to relatives who had already revealed the limitations of their judgment. She was preparing because General Morrison trusted her expertise, and Robert Hamilton was counting on her recommendations. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted email from the Defense Intelligence Agency containing updated threat assessments for Pacific shipping lanes. As Sarah opened the classified materials and began incorporating the new information into her strategic analysis, she felt the familiar focus that had carried her through countless military operations. This was her element, high-stakes decision-making under pressure, where competence mattered more than credentials and results spoke louder than assumption. The irony wasn't lost on her that while her family had been debating whether she was qualified for her current position, the Pentagon was already discussing promoting her to responsibilities that would affect global military logistics. General Morrison hadn't requested her briefing because of her MBA or her corporate title. He had requested it because Captain Chen had proven herself capable of solving impossible problems under impossible conditions. Sarah worked through the night, fueled by coffee and the kind of intense concentration that had once helped her coordinate supply convoys through hostile territory. By 0400 hours, she had transformed scattered intelligence reports and financial projections into a comprehensive strategic framework that could revolutionize how the military approached Pacific logistics operations. As dawn began filtering through her apartment windows, Sarah stood and stretched, reviewing the presentation materials that would either launch her into the top tier of defense industry leadership, or remind everyone why family members sometimes knew better than they claimed. But looking at the detailed plans spread across her table, plans that could affect the security of allied nations and the safety of American service members, Sarah felt only confidence in her preparation and clarity about her qualification. General Morrison would receive exactly what he had requested, the expert analysis of someone who understood both the theoretical frameworks of logistics management and the practical realities of keeping soldiers alive in combat zones. Whether her family believed she was capable of providing that analysis was no longer her concern. At 0530 hours, Sarah began getting dressed for what would either be the most important day of her career, or simply another Tuesday morning in the life of someone who had earned the right to brief three-star generals on matters of national importance. The only question was whether she could execute under pressure the way she always had before, but then again Captain Chen had never failed a mission yet. Sarah arrived at Meridian Technologies headquarters at 0630 hours, 2 hours before her scheduled meeting with General Morrison. The Arlington office building was still mostly empty, its marble lobby echoing with the sound of her heels as she crossed to the executive elevators. Her reflection in the polished floors showed a woman in a perfectly tailored navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase that contained strategic recommendations worth billions of dollars and potentially thousands of lives. The 32nd floor was silent except for the hum of computers that never slept, monitoring global logistics operations that spanned 6 time zones. Sarah's corner office overlooked the Potomac River, with the Pentagon visible in the distance like a concrete reminder of the weight her recommendations would carry. She had arrived early not because she needed more preparation time, but because she wanted to center herself in the environment where her expertise was never questioned. At 0700 hours, Robert Hamilton appeared at her office door, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone whose company's survival depended on the next 3 hours. Sarah, thank you for getting here early. I wanted to review the presentation one more time before the general arrives. They spread the briefing materials across her conference table, detailed maps showing proposed supply routes, financial projections demonstrating cost savings, and classified intelligence assessments that painted a comprehensive picture of Pacific theater logistics challenges. Sarah walked Robert through each element of her strategic framework, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had briefed senior military leadership dozens of times before. The key insight, Sarah explained, pointing to a map marked with alternative shipping routes, is that our current approach assumes stability in traditional supply chains. but my combat experience taught me that you have to plan for disruption, not hope it doesn't happen. Robert nodded, his business school training helping him follow the logic even though he lacked Sarah's operational background. The cost savings from your proposed regional distribution hubs are impressive, but what about the initial infrastructure investment? That's where the Pentagon's long-term strategic thinking comes in, Sarah replied. They're not just buying logistics services, they're buying resilience, the ability to maintain operations even when primary supply lines are compromised. At 0745 hours, Meridian's security desk called to announce General Morrison's arrival. Sarah gathered her materials with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that small details could determine the success of major operations. Her presentation would either establish Meridian as the Pentagon's primary Pacific logistics partner, or remind everyone why traditional defense contractors with conventional leadership typically won these competitions. The executive conference room had been configured for a military-style briefing, with large monitors displaying Sarah's strategic maps and a secure communication link to Pentagon officials who would be observing remotely. As General Morrison entered the room, followed by 2 full colonels and a civilian analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency, Sarah felt the familiar clarity that came with high-stakes professional challenges. General Morrison was exactly as Sarah remembered from their interactions during her final deployment, a lean, intense man whose quiet authority filled whatever room he occupied. His presence reminded Sarah of the weight that military leadership carried, the responsibility for decisions that affected not just corporate profits, but national security and human lives. Ms. Chen, the general said, extending his hand with the respect accorded to recognized experts. I've been looking forward to this briefing. Your analysis of our Afghan logistics vulnerabilities was instrumental in improving our withdrawal operation. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied, meeting his handshake with the firm confidence of someone who had earned the right to brief 3-star generals. I'm honored by the opportunity to discuss Pacific Theater logistics. As the Pentagon officials joined the meeting via secure video link, Sarah felt the familiar transition into what she thought of as command mode, the mental space where complexity simplified into clear decision points and strategic options became obvious rather than overwhelming. This was her element, the environment where her unique combination of academic training and combat experience created capabilities that couldn't be replicated by conventional corporate executives. General, if I may begin with the strategic overview, Sarah said, her voice carrying the calm authority that had once directed marine logistics operations under hostile fire. The presentation that followed would either validate her expertise at the highest levels of defense planning, or serve as a reminder that sometimes family members' doubts about qualifications were more accurate than professional achievements suggested. But as Sarah began outlining her strategic framework for Pacific Theater logistics, watching General Morrison's expression shift from polite attention to genuine interest, she felt only confidence in the analysis she was presenting. Her recommendations weren't based on theoretical business school concepts or corporate best practices. They were grounded in hard-won experience managing life and death supply chains under the worst possible conditions. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on her. Less than 12 hours ago, her own family had been explaining why she wasn't qualified for her current position. Now she was briefing the senior military leadership responsible for defending the entire Pacific region, and they were treating her analysis as critical input for billion-dollar strategic decisions. The fundamental challenge, Sarah continued, her laser pointer highlighting critical supply route vulnerabilities, is that our current Pacific logistic infrastructure assumes peacetime conditions and stable international shipping lanes. But if we've learned anything from recent global events, it's that stability can't be assumed. General Morrison leaned forward, his expression showing the intense focus of someone processing information that could affect major military planning decisions. Ms. Chen, your assessment matches our classified intelligence projections. The question is whether the solutions you're proposing are operationally feasible given current budget constraints. Sarah smiled, recognizing the moment when theoretical planning met practical implementation, the point where her combat experience became most valuable. General, that's exactly what I wanted to address next. Based on my field experience with expeditionary logistics, I believe we can achieve greater resilience at lower cost, but only if we're willing to challenge some fundamental assumptions about how military supply chains should operate. The next 45 minutes would determine not just Meridian's future, but Sarah's own trajectory in the defense industry. But as she began outlining innovative solutions that combined cutting-edge technology with lessons learned from combat logistics operations, Sarah felt only the calm confidence of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she had worked so hard to become. Her family might never understand her qualifications, but General Morrison clearly did. And in Sarah's world, that was the only opinion that mattered. The presentation unfolded with the precision of a military operation that Sarah had spent years perfecting. Her laser pointer traced shipping routes across the Pacific as she outlined vulnerabilities that traditional defense contractors had never considered, drawing from combat experience that couldn't be learned in business school or replicated through theoretical study. The critical flaw in our current approach, Sarah explained, her voice steady as she addressed the most senior military logistics leadership in the country, is that we're designing supply chains for efficiency rather than resilience. But in contested environments, efficiency becomes a liability. General Morrison's aide was taking detailed notes while the Pentagon officials on the secure video link leaned forward to better see Sarah's strategic map. Colonel Patricia Williams, joining from her Pentagon office, nodded approvingly as Sarah outlined solutions that addressed problems the military had been struggling with for years. "Chen," interrupted Colonel James Rodriguez from the video link, "your proposed hub-and-spoke distribution model is innovative, but how do we maintain operational security with increased infrastructure footprint?" Sarah had anticipated this question, drawing from her experience managing supply operations under constant threat of enemy surveillance. "Colonel, that's where we leverage dispersed storage and dynamic routing protocol. Instead of fixed supply depots that become obvious targets, we use mobile distribution networks that can adapt to changing threat environments." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a map that showed potential supply routes shifting in real time based on intelligence assessment. "During my final deployment, I developed protocols for supply chain adaptation under hostile conditions. We can apply those same principles to Pacific theater operations, creating logistics networks that become more secure as they scale up rather than more vulnerable. Robert Hamilton watched the military officials' reactions with growing amazement. He had hired Sarah based on her credentials and reputation, but witnessing her brief senior Pentagon leadership was like discovering that his vice president was actually a world-class expert whose capabilities he had dramatically underestimated. General Morrison stood and walked to the large monitor displaying Sarah's strategic framework. "Miss Chen, this adaptive distribution concept addresses vulnerabilities that our traditional contractors haven't even acknowledged exist. How quickly could these protocols be implemented across existing Pacific operations?" "Sir, based on my analysis of current infrastructure and available resources, we could begin phased implementation within 90 days. Sarah replied. "The beauty of this approach is that it improves efficiency during peacetime while providing enhanced resilience during crisis situations." The room fell silent as the implications of Sarah's recommendations settled in. She wasn't just proposing incremental improvements to existing logistics operations. She was outlining a fundamental transformation that could revolutionize how the military approached supply chain management in contested environments. Colonel Williams spoke from the Pentagon video link, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had worked with Sarah during her military service. "General, I had the privilege of observing Miss Chen develop some of these concepts during combat operations. Her field testing of adaptive logistics protocols contributed directly to mission success in highly contested environments." The endorsement from a respected Pentagon official carried significant weight, but Sarah noticed that General Morrison's expression had shifted from polite attention to genuine excitement. He was processing her recommendations not as theoretical proposals but as proven solutions that could be scaled up to address strategic challenges. "Miss Chen," the general said, returning to his seat, "I need to ask you directly, are you confident that Meridian Technologies has the capability to implement these recommendations at the scale we're discussing?" The Pacific Theater contract would involve coordination across multiple countries, integration with allied military systems, and management of supply chains worth approximately $12 billion annually. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah realized that this was the moment when her professional reputation would be established or destroyed, when her expertise would be validated at the highest levels or revealed as insufficient for the responsibility being offered. But as she looked around the conference room at senior military officials who were treating her analysis as critical input for major strategic decisions, Sarah felt only calm confidence in her response. "General, I'm not just confident in Meridian's capabilities. I'm confident in the strategic framework I've developed based on 5 combat deployments and extensive analysis of Pacific logistics vulnerabilities," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to make such claims. "The protocols I'm recommending aren't theoretical. They're proven solutions that have been tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable." General Morrison exchanged glances with his staff officers, their silent communication reflecting years of working together on complex military planning decisions. Sarah could sense that her briefing had exceeded their expectations, that her recommendations had addressed problems they hadn't expected a civilian contractor to understand. "Ms. Chen," the general said, "finally, I'm prepared to recommend that the Pentagon move forward with expanding Meridian's contracts based on your strategic framework. But I need to know, are you personally committed to overseeing implementation of these protocols? Because frankly, your expertise appears to be central to making this work." The question was both an offer and a test. General Morrison was essentially asking whether Sarah was willing to stake her professional reputation on the success of the largest logistics contract in Pentagon history. It was the kind of responsibility that could launch her into the top tier of defense industry leadership or destroy her career if the implementation failed. Sarah thought briefly about the conversation she'd had with her family just 12 hours earlier, when they had been explaining why she wasn't qualified for her current position. Now she was being asked to take responsibility for strategic decisions that would affect military operations across the entire Pacific region. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I'm fully committed to ensuring successful implementation of these protocols. This isn't just about corporate contracts. It's about providing our military with the logistics capabilities they need to maintain operational readiness in an increasingly complex strategic environment." General Morrison smiled for the first time during the meeting, the expression of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. "Outstanding. Colonel Williams will coordinate with your team on the implementation timeline. I expect regular progress reports and immediate notification of any operational challenges." As the meeting concluded, and Pentagon officials logged off the secure video link, Robert Hamilton looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal amazement. His vice president had just secured the largest contract in Meridian's history by demonstrating expertise that most defense industry executives could only dream of possessing. But for Sarah, the successful briefing felt less like a triumph and more like a return to her natural element. This was who she had always been, someone capable of solving complex problems under pressure, developing innovative solutions to strategic challenges, and earning the trust of senior leadership through demonstrated competence rather than inherited credentials. The only question now was whether her family would be capable of understanding what had just happened, or whether they would find new ways to explain away achievements that challenged their fundamental assumptions about qualifications and success. As General Morrison and his staff departed from Meridian's headquarters, Sarah found herself alone in the executive conference room with Robert Hamilton, surrounded by the presentation materials that had just secured the most important contract in the company's history. The silence was profound after the intensity of the briefing, broken only by the distant hum of Arlington traffic and the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Robert leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with the expression of someone still processing what had just occurred. "Sarah, I knew you were exceptional when I hired you, but what I just witnessed, that wasn't just a business presentation, that was a masterclass in strategic thinking that I'm not sure anyone else in the defense industry could have delivered." Sarah was methodically organizing her classified materials for return to the secure filing system, her movements reflecting the discipline that had served her through countless military operations. "Robert, this is what you hired me to do." General Morrison needed solutions to problems that most civilian contractors don't understand, because they've never had to manage supply chains under hostile fire. But $12 billion, Sarah. The Pentagon is essentially trusting you with logistics responsibility for the entire Pacific theater. Do you understand the magnitude of what just happened? Sarah paused in her document organization and looked directly at her. I understand that General Morrison recognizes my expertise because he's seen the results of my work under actual combat conditions. Military leaders care about competence and proven results, not traditional corporate credentials. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Williams. Sarah, outstanding briefing. Morrison is already discussing accelerated implementation timeline. The Pentagon hasn't seen this level of innovation in logistics planning in decades. Your combat experience really showed today. Proud to have served with you. Robert noticed Sarah's slight smile as she read the message. Good news? Confirmation that the briefing met Pentagon expectations. Sarah replied, Colonel Williams was my commanding officer during my final deployment. Her opinion carries significant weight in military logistics circles. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Robert's expression grew more serious. Sarah, I need to ask you something. Yesterday when we discussed this briefing, you seemed almost nervous. Isn't the right word, uncertain and maybe, but today you were completely confident, like you belonged in that room with 3-star generals. What changed? Sarah considered the question as they walked toward the elevator. How could she explain that last night's confrontation with her family had forced her to choose between their version of her capabilities and the Pentagon's assessment of her expertise? How could she describe the liberation that came from finally stopping the exhausting effort to seek approval from people whose judgment had proven fundamentally flawed? I stopped second-guessing myself, she said finally. Sometimes the people closest to us are the least qualified to assess our professional capabilities. The elevator arrived, and as they descended from the 32nd floor, Robert continued processing the implications of the morning's success. Sarah, General Morrison essentially offered you a position that will make you one of the most influential logistics experts in the country. This isn't just about Meridian anymore. You're going to be setting strategic policy for Pacific military operations. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with the Pentagon's trust, but she also felt the calm confidence that came from knowing she had earned that trust through proven competence rather than inherited privilege or traditional credential. Her phone rang as they reached the lobby. The caller ID showed her mother's number, and Sarah realized that news of her successful briefing might have already reached her family through channels she hadn't considered. Sarah, dear, came her mother's voice. I just received the most interesting phone call from Dr. Patricia's husband. He works for a defense consulting firm, and apparently there's been quite a buzz this morning about some major Pentagon contract announcement involving Meridian Technologies. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she realized her family was about to discover the magnitude of her professional responsibilities through external sources rather than her own explanations. Mom, I'm just leaving a meeting. Can I call you back later? Of course, sweetheart. But Sarah, Dr. Patricia's husband, mentioned that whoever briefed the Pentagon this morning apparently impressed some very senior military officials. He said the defense industry is talking about it as a potential game changer for Pacific logistics operations. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. Less than 24 hours after her family had spent an entire dinner explaining why she wasn't qualified for her current position, the defense industry was discussing her strategic recommendations as potentially revolutionary improvements to military logistics operations. I'll call you later, Mom, Sarah repeated, ending the conversation before it could develop into another round of well-intentioned misconceptions about her professional reality. Robert had overheard enough of the conversation to understand the subtext. Sarah, I take it your family still doesn't fully appreciate the scope of your professional achievements. My family means well, Sarah replied diplomatically, but they tend to underestimate capabilities that don't fit their traditional understanding of success. As they crossed the lobby toward the parking garage, Robert's expression grew thoughtful. You know, one of the most impressive things about this morning's briefing was how you handled General Morrison's question. You didn't just present theoretical solutions, you demonstrated deep understanding of operational realities that can only come from actual experience. Sarah paused at her car, considering how to respond to her CEO's observation. Robert, in combat zones, theoretical knowledge gets people killed. You learn to distinguish between what sounds good in planning meetings and what actually works when lives depend on your decisions. That's exactly what General Morrison was looking for, Robert said. The Pentagon has been frustrated with traditional defense contractors who provide elegant solutions that fail under operational stress. Your combat experience gives you credibility that can't be faked or learned from textbooks. As Sarah drove home through Arlington traffic, she reflected on the morning's success and its implications for her relationship with her family. The Pentagon had just entrusted her with strategic responsibility for Pacific military logistics, validating her expertise at the highest levels of national defense planning. But she knew that explaining this achievement to people who had spent years questioning her basic professional competence would require more than simply describing the contract detail. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Tyler. Sarah, Emma found an article online about some big Pentagon logistics contract. It mentions your name and says you're like really important now. Is this the same job our family was saying you weren't qualified for last night? Sarah smiled at her cousin's direct question, appreciating the honesty that only teenagers could deliver. Tyler had managed to identify the core contradiction that the adults in her family would probably struggle to acknowledge: the gap between their assessment of her capabilities and the Pentagon's evaluation of her expertise. The question now wasn't whether she could succeed in her expanded role. General Morrison's confidence in Colonel Williams' endorsement had settled that issue. The question was whether her family would be capable of understanding that their assumptions about qualifications, credentials, and professional success might need some fundamental reconsideration. But as Sarah pulled into her apartment complex, she realized that her family's opinion had become secondary to her own understanding of her capability. The Pentagon trusted her judgment, her CEO valued her expertise, and her strategic recommendations would shape military operations across the Pacific region. Whether her relatives could accept those realities was their challenge to overcome, not hers to manage. Sarah arrived at her apartment to find 17 missed calls and 43 text messages accumulated during her 3-hour Pentagon briefing. As she scrolled through the notifications, she realized that news of the Pacific Theater contract had spread through both military and civilian networks with surprising speed. Defense industry publications had already posted breaking news articles, and her name was being mentioned in the same sentences as senior Pentagon officials and billion-dollar strategic initiatives. The first call she returned was to Colonel Williams, whose Pentagon office had been fielding inquiries about Sarah's background and qualifications since the briefing concluded. "Sarah, I've never seen response like this to a contractor presentation," Patricia said, her voice carrying both excitement and concern. "General Morrison is already discussing accelerated implementation timelines, and 3 different defense committees want briefings on your strategic framework. Is that unusual?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Sarah, in 30 years of military service, I've seen thousands of contractor presentations. Most of them are forgotten within hours. Yours is being discussed as potentially revolutionary for Pacific defense strategy. The Joint Chiefs are requesting copies of your analysis." As Sarah processed the implications of Colonel Williams' update, her phone displayed an incoming call from her brother David. She let it go to voicemail, knowing that whatever conversation awaited her with her family would require more emotional preparation than she currently possessed. Instead, she opened her laptop and began reviewing the flood of emails that had accumulated throughout the morning. Messages from Pentagon officials, defense industry executives, and military logistics specialists created a digital paper trail of professional validation that would have been impossible to fabricate. Sarah's expertise wasn't just being recognized, it was being actively sought by the highest levels of military leadership. Her doorbell rang, and Sarah looked through the peephole to see a courier holding an envelope marked with Pentagon security classification. She signed for the delivery and opened it to find official orders requesting her immediate security clearance upgrade to handle the classified materials that would be central to Pacific Theater logistics planning. The irony was overwhelming. Less than 18 hours after her family had questioned whether she was qualified for her current position, the Pentagon was requesting that she receive higher security clearances to access some of the most sensitive military planning documents in the country. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Sarah, I'm looking at an article in Defense News that calls you one of the most innovative logistics strategists in the defense industry. The article says Pentagon officials are describing your briefing as paradigm shifting for Pacific military operations. Is this real? The question reflected the confusion that Sarah expected her family was experiencing. Their version of her capabilities simply couldn't accommodate the reality of her professional achievements, forcing them to question whether the external validation was somehow mistaken or exaggerated. Before she could respond to Emma's text, her phone rang again. This time it was Robert Hamilton, calling from his office, where he was apparently fielding inquiries from defense industry colleagues who wanted to understand how Meridian had developed such innovative logistics capability. Sarah, I've had 12 calls in the past hour from CEOs of major defense contractors asking about your background and whether you're available for consulting work. Robert said, his voice reflecting amazement at the industry response. Lockheed Martin's logistics director wants to discuss potential collaboration. Raytheon is asking about your availability for strategic planning consultation. Sarah felt a familiar sense of validation mixed with exhaustion. The professional recognition was gratifying, but it also highlighted the gap between her family's assessment of her capabilities and the reality of her expertise as evaluated by people who actually understood her field. Robert, I'm committed to implementing the Pacific Theater protocols, Sarah replied, but I appreciate the industry interest. It confirms that our strategic approach is addressing real problems that traditional contractors haven't been able to solve. After ending the call, Sarah sat at her kitchen table and stared at the accumulating evidence of her professional success. Pentagon security clearance requests, industry recognition, strategic planning invitations, all of it validated her expertise in ways that should have been impossible according to her family's assessment of her qualification. Her phone buzzed with a voicemail from her father, Sarah. I've been hearing some very interesting things about your work today. Judge Patterson's son works for a Pentagon contractor, and he mentioned that there's been significant discussion about some innovative logistics presentation that has senior military officials very excited. Sarah, I'm beginning to think we may have misunderstood the scope of your professional responsibilities. The careful phrasing, may have misunderstood rather than were completely wrong, was so typically her father that Sarah almost laughed. Even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of his error, Judge Chen couldn't quite bring himself to admit the full extent of his misjudgment. Another text arrived from Tyler. Sarah, my friend's dad is a military contractor, and he says everyone is talking about some woman who gave an amazing briefing to a 3-star general today. He didn't know her name but said she revolutionized how the Pentagon thinks about Pacific logistics. Was that you? Sarah stared at her cousin's message, recognizing the moment when her family's protective narrative would finally collide with external reality. Tyler's friend's father was describing her professional achievement without knowing her identity, providing independent validation that couldn't be dismissed as family bias or corporate exaggeration. As she prepared to respond to the accumulated messages from her family, Sarah realized that she was about to have a very different conversation than the one that had occurred at last night's dinner. The question was no longer whether she was qualified for her current position. The Pentagon had settled that issue definitively. The question was whether her family was capable of acknowledging that their fundamental assumptions about her capabilities had been wrong. But, as Sarah looked at the Pentagon's security clearance request on her table and the industry recognition accumulating on her phone, she felt only calm confidence about the conversation ahead. Her family's opinion of her qualifications was no longer central to her understanding of her own capability. The Pentagon trusted her expertise, the defense industry was seeking her strategic advice, and General Morrison was counting on her recommendations to reshape military logistics operations across the Pacific region. Whether her relatives could accept those realities was their challenge to overcome, not hers to manage. Sarah took a deep breath and began typing responses to her family's messages, knowing that the conversation about her qualifications was about to take a very different direction than any of them had anticipated. Sarah decided to address her family's growing confusion with the directness that military service had taught her was most effective in complex situations. Instead of responding to individual messages, she composed a group text to her parents, siblings, and cousins. "I'm available for a family call at 1800 hours. If you'd like to discuss today's Pentagon briefing and its implications for Pacific defense strategy." The response was immediate. Her phone began ringing within minutes, and Sarah found herself on a conference call with her entire family, their voices overlapping as they tried to process the day's revelation. But this time, instead of explaining why her achievements were impossible, they were asking questions that assumed her expertise was real. "Sarah," her father began, his judicial tone now carrying respect rather than patronizing correction, "I've been making some calls today. Judge Patterson's son confirmed that Pentagon officials are describing your briefing as potentially revolutionary for military logistics operations. I need to formally apologize for underestimating your professional capability." "Dad, I appreciate that," Sarah replied, though she noticed he still couldn't quite bring himself to acknowledge the full extent of his error. "But I need you to understand that this isn't about one successful brief. This is about years of developing expertise that you've consistently dismissed." David's voice came through the phone with the humility of someone whose professional instincts had been proven completely wrong. "Sarah, I spent the afternoon researching Pacific Theater logistics contract. What you accomplished today, the financial implications alone are staggering. But more than that, defense industry analysts are saying your strategic approach could reshape how the military thinks about supply chain management." "That's correct," Sarah confirmed. "The protocols I presented were developed during combat operations and tested under the most demanding conditions imaginable. General Morrison requested my analysis because traditional contractors haven't been able to solve the problems he's facing." Jennifer's voice carried the precision of someone who had spent her career making life-and-death decisions based on expertise. "Sarah, I owe you an apology that goes beyond professional misjudgment. I've been condescending to you for years because I didn't understand that your field requires different qualifications than mine. Combat experience and strategic thinking skills can't be learned in medical school." Emma's voice bubbled with excitement that only a college student could maintain. "Sarah, this is actually incredible. I've been reading defense industry publications all day, and your name keeps appearing in articles about innovation in military logistics. You're like actually famous in your field." "I'm not famous, Emma," Sarah replied gently. "I'm simply recognized by people who understand the work I do. There's a difference." Tyler's voice cut through the family conversation with his characteristic directness. "So Sarah, just to be clear, yesterday we were all telling you that you weren't qualified for your job, and today the Pentagon is basically saying you're one of the most important people in military logistics." "That's an accurate summary," Sarah confirmed, appreciating her cousin's ability to identify the core contradiction without diplomatic cushioning. Patricia's voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades evaluating professional competence. "Sarah, I need to acknowledge something uncomfortable. We've been operating under assumptions about your capabilities that were based on outdated information and our own limited understanding of your field. Today's events have forced me to confront my own biases." "I appreciate that admission," Sarah replied, "but I need you to understand that this pattern of underestimating my capabilities has affected our relationship for years. It's not just about misunderstanding one job, it's about consistently refusing to believe that I could achieve success that didn't fit your traditional expectations." Her mother's voice was thick with emotion. "Sarah, darling, I've been thinking about this all day. How many times have you tried to share your achievements with us, only to have us explain why they weren't what you thought they were?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing the family to confront the cumulative impact of years of well-intentioned dismissal. Sarah could hear the discomfort in their silence as they processed the implications of her mother's observation. "The answer is, consistently," Sarah said quietly. "Every promotion, every recognition, every professional achievement has been met with explanations about why it wasn't quite what I claimed it was. After a while, I stopped trying to convince you. Michael's lawyer voice carried genuine remorse. Sarah, I'm realizing that we've been applying our own professional standards to your field, without understanding that military logistics requires different qualifications than law or medicine or banking. Your path to expertise was valid. We just didn't recognize it. More than that, Sarah replied, you refused to recognize it even when presented with evidence. Last night when David found my company biography and Pentagon testimonials, you immediately began explaining why those credentials weren't legitimate. You couldn't accept that your assessment of my capabilities might be wrong. Robert Hamilton had warned Sarah that industry recognition of her expertise would likely accelerate rapidly, but she hadn't expected the pace of validation that had occurred throughout the day. Her phone continued buzzing with messages from defense officials, industry executives, and military logistics specialists who wanted to discuss strategic collaboration. Sarah, her father said finally, I need to ask you directly, what would it take for us to rebuild your trust? How can we demonstrate that we've learned from this mistake? The question was fair but complex. Sarah looked around her apartment at the Pentagon security clearance documents, the industry recognition accumulating on her phone, and the strategic planning materials that would shape military operations across the Pacific region. Her family's opinion of her capabilities was no longer central to her understanding of her own expertise. I need you to understand that respect isn't retroactive, Sarah replied. You can't apologize for years of dismissing my achievements and expect everything to return to normal. The damage has been done, and rebuilding trust will require consistent demonstration that you've genuinely changed how you view my capabilities. Tyler's voice broke through the heavy conversation. Sarah, I have one more question. If you're this important to military logistics, and you've been successful for years, why do you still drive that old Honda and live in a regular apartment? I thought successful people were supposed to be flashy. Sarah smiled at her cousin's honest confusion. Tyler, my priorities are different from what you might expect. I don't need external displays of success to validate my achievements. The Pentagon's confidence in my expertise is worth more than any luxury car. As the family call concluded, Sarah realized that her relationship with her relatives had fundamentally changed. They were no longer authorities whose approval she sought. They were people whose judgment had proven unreliable, and whose support would need to be earned through demonstrated change rather than promised intention. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she began implementing the Pacific Theater logistics protocols that General Morrison had requested. But tonight, Sarah felt the satisfaction of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she had worked so hard to become. The Pentagon trusted her expertise. The defense industry was seeking her strategic advice, and General Morrison was counting on her recommendations to reshape military operations across the Pacific region. Whether her family could accept those realities was their challenge to overcome, not hers to manage. But for the first time in years, Sarah sensed that they might actually be ready to try. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the Roosevelt Room of the White House, wearing her dress blues adorned with ribbons that told the story of a warrior's journey from combat zones to the highest levels of national security plan. The president was about to sign legislation creating the Pacific Defense Logistics Command, a new military branch designed around the strategic framework Sarah had developed during her briefing with General Morrison. Chen, the president said, turning to address her directly before the assembled cabinet members, Pentagon officials and invited guests. Your innovations in military logistics have fundamentally transformed how America approaches defense strategy in the Pacific region. The protocols you developed have already saved the military over $2 billion while significantly improving operational readiness. Sarah accepted the recognition with the same calm professionalism that had carried her through 5 combat deployments and countless briefings with senior military leadership. But as she looked toward the audience, she spotted familiar faces in the back row. Her entire family, dressed in their finest clothes, watching with expressions that mixed pride, amazement, and what appeared to be genuine respect. Her father, Judge Chen, sat with tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter being recognized by the President of the United States for achievements that had reshaped American military strategy. David wore the stunned expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about success had been completely overturned. Jennifer and Patricia sat together, their medical training helping them appreciate the precision and expertise required for the kind of strategic thinking Sarah had demonstrated, but it was Tyler who captured the moment perfectly. As the president finished his remarks and the formal ceremony concluded, Sarah's 17-year-old cousin approached her with the directness that only teenagers could manage. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and embarrassment, "I need to ask you something. How long have you been this amazing, and how did we not notice?" Sarah smiled, remembering the dinner conversation that had started this entire journey toward family understanding. "Tyler, I've been the same person all along. The only thing that changed was that I finally stopped asking for permission to be successful." Emma, now a junior at Yale with a newfound appreciation for non-traditional career paths, joined the conversation. "Sarah, my business professors are using your strategic framework as a case study in innovative leadership. They're teaching it alongside examples from Fortune 500 CEOs and military strategists." As the White House reception continued around them, Sarah's family gathered in a small circle, their body language reflecting a fundamental shift in how they related to each other. The protective condescension that had characterized their previous interactions had been replaced by genuine curiosity about Sarah's expertise and respect for her achievement. "Sarah," her mother said softly, "I keep thinking about that night 6 months ago when we were so certain you were confused about your job responsibility. The irony is devastating. While we were explaining why you weren't qualified for your position, you were preparing to brief the Pentagon on strategies that would reshape American military operations." Michael nodded, his lawyer's analytical mind still processing the implication. "What's most striking is that we weren't just wrong about your current success, we were wrong about your fundamental capabilities. Everything we thought we knew about your potential was based on assumptions that had no connection to reality." Sarah looked around at her family members, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. They weren't the towering authorities whose approval she had desperately sought throughout her childhood and early adulthood. They were simply people whose own limitations had prevented them from recognizing capabilities that existed outside their narrow understanding of achievement. "The most important lesson," Sarah said quietly, "isn't about my specific career path. It's about the danger of assuming that your understanding of success is the only valid framework for evaluating someone else's potential." Judge Chen approached his daughter with the formal bearing he typically reserved for the most serious court proceeding. "Sarah, I need to say something publicly in front of the family." He paused, gathering his thoughts with the precision of someone who understood that words carried weight and consequences. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Not just about your job, not just about your qualifications, but about your fundamental capabilities as a person. I allowed my own biases and limited understanding to override clear evidence of your expertise. I failed you as a father, and I failed myself as someone who should have recognized excellence regardless of whether it fit my expectation." The admission was so complete, so devoid of the careful qualifications that had characterized his previous apologies, that Sarah felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't diplomatic damage control. This was genuine acknowledgement of error and its consequences. "More than that," David added, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent months examining his own assumptions, "we need to acknowledge that Sarah's success wasn't achieved despite our lack of support. It was achieved because she had the strength to stop letting our limitations define her potential." As the White House reception drew to a close and the family prepared to leave, Tyler approached Sarah one final time. "Sarah, I have one last question. When you were sitting at that dinner table 6 months ago, listening to us explain why you weren't qualified for your job, what were you thinking?" Sarah considered her cousin's question, remembering the moment when she had finally decided to stop seeking validation from people whose judgment had proven fundamentally flawed. "Tyler, I was thinking that I had a choice. I could keep trying to convince you that my achievements were real, or I could focus on the people who already understood the value of my expertise. And you chose the Pentagon over your family. I chose reality over comfortable illusions," Sarah replied. "The Pentagon's assessment of my capabilities was based on evidence and results. Your family's assessment was based on assumptions and outdated information. When those two perspectives conflicted, I had to decide which one I trusted more." As they walked out of the White House together, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from General Morrison. Sarah, congratulations on today's recognition. The Pacific Defense Logistics Command will be formally activated next month, and I want you to know that your strategic framework has already been requested by allied nations for their own military planning. Your expertise is reshaping international defense strategy. Sarah showed the message to her family, not because she needed their validation, but because she wanted them to understand the full scope of what they had almost missed. Their daughter, sister, and cousin wasn't just successful, she was influential at levels that most people could only imagine. Sarah, her mother said as they reached the White House gates, I have one final question. Can you forgive us for taking so long to see you clearly? Sarah looked at her mother, then at her father, siblings, and cousins, who had gathered around to hear her response. These people had shaped her understanding of worth and achievement for 3 decades, and their doubt had nearly convinced her to question her own capability. I can forgive you, Sarah said finally, but I need you to understand that forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You missed years of my achievements because you were too invested in your own assumptions to see evidence that contradicted them. That's time we can't get back. But, she continued, seeing the pain in their faces, I'm willing to build a new relationship, based on who I actually am rather than who you thought I should be. The question is whether you're capable of seeing me as someone whose expertise and judgment you respect, rather than someone who needs your guidance and protection. As they walked through the streets of Washington, past monuments to leaders who had changed the course of history through vision and determination, Sarah's family began to understand that they had been living with their own version of American greatness all along. They had just been too blinded by their own expectations to recognize it. The woman walking beside them wasn't their little Sarah, who needed career advice and gentle correction. She was Sarah Chen, the strategic architect, whose innovations had reshaped American military logistics, whose expertise was sought by presidents and generals, whose recommendations affected the security of nations. She had been this person all along. The only thing that had changed was that she had finally stopped asking for permission to be exactly who she had worked so hard to become. And perhaps that was the most powerful lesson of all. Sometimes the people who love us most are the least qualified to judge our true potential. The courage to succeed despite their limitations. That's what separates those who achieve greatness from those who spend their lives seeking approval from people who were never qualified to give it. The Pentagon had always known who Sarah Chen was. Now finally, so did her family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.